Liberalism has failed. The liberal paradigm, which began during the Enlightenment, is collapsing. We are at the end of a great civilizational cycle. Another dark age is upon us. But out of this darkness will emerge afresh the doctrine of nature, and new barbarians to revitalize the West and direct it towards a new destiny. The fundamental failure of liberalism is that it does not address the problem of nature, and it moreover conceals it with the idea of natural rights when no such thing exists. Failing to recognize and account for the fundamental laws of nature and concealing them with idealistic human laws is one of the most fatal errors a civilization can make. The Greeks devoted much of their philosophy to the relationship between physis, nature, and nomos, law. Yet the idea of nature, the discovery of nature, is quite rare throughout human history. In Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, Costin Alamariu argues that the idea of nature emerges out of a, quote, refinement, abstraction, or radicalization of the aristocratic way of life and of the principle that underlies aristocratic life and the aristocratic worldview, end quote. He writes, when the idea of nature emerged, it did so in opposition to convention or custom. Cows graze, wolves hunt by nature, but different tribes of people deal differently with the dead, cremation, burial, etc., by custom or convention. It is a notion which is distinctly similar to our nature versus nurture, or nature versus culture, or nature versus social construct. The question of what was by nature or by convention animated much of Greek intellectual life and had important political meaning, for example, with the aristocratic party generally favoring the side of nature and the democratic party generally favoring the side of convention. In the first chapter, I try to explain how the rudimentary idea of nature could have emerged out of the primitive or prehistoric mind, out of the mind as ruled exclusively by ancestral convention or custom. The answer is that it could not. The momentous discovery of nature, which is the precondition of both philosophy and science, is the preserve of one very unusual people, the ancient Greeks, and long thereafter, those parts of Europe where Hellenic civilization was promoted, first by Rome and later in a considerably modified form in Christianity, and various Christian states that had inherited some of the Roman institutions, end quote. Costin argues that the idea of nature emerged in the late stages of Greek aristocracy as a response to the aristocracy's many critics, as a solidification and abstraction of the aristocratic worldview. But we then must ask the origins of the aristocratic worldview. As we have talked about at length on this channel, the first aristocracies were formed out of nomadic, pastoralist peoples conquering sedentary, farmer populations, and imposing their hierarchies and worldview upon them. This means that the aristocratic worldview and the first seeds of the idea of nature were born among pastoralist peoples, as Costin goes on to argue. While the sedentary, tribal life of the farmer is ruled by convention and custom, and he is therefore unable to separate what behaviors he has inherited through custom or religion, and which through biology and nature, a nomadic tribe would have been able to observe a great many peoples and their differing ways of life. This would allow them to observe which behaviors remain consistent across the species, and to formulate a rudimentary idea of human nature. Further, the harsh conditions of the nomadic way of life, which relied upon the breeding of strong herds to live off of, and later the domestication and breeding of horses, would have made ideas of nature and biology especially important to pastoralist peoples. Darwin's natural selection would have been self-evident. Only the strong and the fittest specimens survive the harsh life of the steppe, and sexual selection would have been just as evident. If the fittest specimens are bred, they will improve the quality of the herd over time, and even lead to behavioral alterations, like the domestication of horses. The separation between nature and law, physis and nomos, can be found implicitly as far back as Homer, when Achilles says to Hector in the Iliad, "There are no pacts between lions and men, no peace between wolves and sheep." Recognizing that he is about to die, Hector asks Achilles to allow him to be buried honorably in accordance with the customs and laws of man. But Achilles rejects this offer, appealing instead to the laws of nature, which are absolute and final. There are no laws, no peace treaties, no pacts, no mercy in nature. In the later stages of Greek culture, the dichotomy between nature and law becomes more explicit, as the aristocracy who claimed the divine right to rule based upon their descent from gods and heroes, and therefore upon their natural superiority, sought to defend itself against democracy, the rule by custom and law alone. We only have fragments of the sophist Antiphon, but they give us a great insight into how the aristocratic faction in Athens thought. He writes, quote, "Justice, then, is not to transgress that which is the law of the city in which one is a citizen. A man, therefore, can best conduct himself in harmony with justice if, when in the company of witnesses, he upholds the laws, and when alone without witnesses, he upholds the edicts of nature. For the edicts of the laws are imposed artificially, but those of nature are compulsory, and the edicts of the laws are arrived at by consent, not by natural growth, whereas those of nature are not a matter of consent." End quote. Just as Achilles did, Antiphon argues that the laws of nature reign supreme, while the laws of men are constructed and only exist within the polis, the city, within civilization. The edicts of nature, the laws which govern life, which govern biology, are compulsory and exist regardless of consent. In Athens, Greek tragedy marked the transition from aristocracy to democracy. In the plays which survive, there is a constant struggle between law and nature, between the blood feuds of the divine lineages of the Bronze Age and the justice and law of the city. And Euripides, the last of the three great Greek tragedians, and a good friend of Socrates, openly ridicules aristocratic ideas of the gods and nature, although in his final play, the Bacchae, he actually seems to recognize the supremacy of nature in the form of Dionysus. The democratic movement in Athens criticized ideas of both nature and the divine because the two ideas were closely associated for the Greeks. The aristocracies claimed the right to rule not just by their natural superiority, but because of their divine descent from ancient heroes, as was the case with the Heraclids, who claimed descent from Heracles. And aside from the pagan gods of Greece being intimately connected with the forces of nature, the primary focus of Hellenic religion was the miraculous rebirth of life out of death, celebrated in the mystery cults. The seasonal rebirth of plant life and the generational rebirth of animal and human life through reproduction presented for the Greeks the common nature shared by all biological life, the very miracle of life itself. At the very center of Hellenic culture was the idea of nature. Now that we understand the origins of the idea of nature, we have to delve into the origins of liberalism. Among the Jews, an anti-aristocratic revolution also took place in the form of Christianity. The religion of the Israelites at the time was organized around purity laws and laws of marriage and reproduction. And since Jesus was born out of wedlock, he would have likely been considered a mamzer, impure, and been treated as an outcast. Jesus advocated for the abolition of these purity laws, baptism for all, communion with God for all. There shall be no Greek and no Jew. Therefore he democratized the religion of the Israelites. The Gospels of Paul and John implicitly attack the Greek mystery rites, saying that the body, bios, life, is just a dying vessel, and that true, eternal life is found in the spirit and the afterlife. The Christianity of Jesus and the Gospels was a refutation against nature. It claimed that the laws of nature are not in fact compulsory. You can simply refuse to consent to them. This is the ascetic doctrine. But the laws of God and heaven are eternal. Your body will die, but your soul will live forever. Therefore, clan, tribe, offspring do not matter. They are arbitrary divisions. All that matters is the relationship of an individual with God and the individual's soul. This is the foundation of liberalism. However, we still need to go through a few detours to arrive at the doctrine of liberalism. In Europe, the pagan idea of nature and the natural and divine right to rule continued on even after Europe's Christianization. Thus, in Europe, the Christian God, who originally stood outside of nature, apart from nature, and opposed to nature, was conflated with nature. The laws of God are the laws of nature, for the world was created by God and proceeds from him. This is a pagan idea, not a Christian one, and it is here that the fundamental fallacy of liberalism arose. The conflation of nature and the divine makes sense in Hellenic paganism, since the Greeks did not consider either the gods or the laws of nature to be moral or idealized, but rather viewed them as cruel and savage, albeit beautiful. But since the Christian God is a moral God, when God and nature were conflated in the European Christian tradition, the laws of nature had to become moral laws, unless God was proven to be immoral. In the European tradition, the pagan ideas of the divine right to rule and the conflation of nature with the divine continued on without interruption until the Reformation, when the original Christian idea that the only thing that matters is the individual soul and their relationship with God returned. The Reformation and the Enlightenment dissolved the idea of the divine right to rule and therefore of the legitimacy of aristocracy. But the conflation of nature with God continued into the Enlightenment, when liberalism was born. At the core of liberalism is the idea that the purpose of a state is to protect the natural rights of a people. The United States Constitution is founded upon the idea that it is an individual's natural right, given by God, to be free, to defend himself, etc. The problem is that these rights, like all the laws of men, are artificially constructed and are not actually found anywhere in nature. As Achilles knew, in nature, rights and freedoms can only be won by force. They are not guaranteed, and in society they are arrived at by the consent of your fellow men and by the state. The state, just as easily as your neighbor, can disregard your natural rights, because, as Antiphon said, the edicts of the laws are imposed artificially. Liberalism claims that artificially constructed human laws and customs, so-called natural rights, are absolute and found self-evidently in nature, when nature in fact contradicts these laws. The worst thing one can do, if one is seeking to found a society which will last, is to found it upon an ideology which ignores the basic facts of nature. By the 20th century, liberalism had already begun to fail due to its own inherent contradictions. The idea of nature, not clouded by morality or law, was rediscovered in the late 19th century with Darwin, Nietzsche, and other writers who were essentially rediscovering what the Greeks had already known. The laws of man are artificially imposed upon nature, but nature cares only for survival, breeding, reproduction, and the struggle to survive and to dominate. Fascist Germany took this realization to an extreme which had only previously been seen among the Spartans, a total erasure of individualism in service of the tribe, and the implementation of eugenics to breed a stronger tribe. It was only due to the post-war reaction to fascism and then to communism that liberalism managed to survive the rediscovery of the ancient idea of nature. But now it seems that liberalism is truly on its last legs, This is because liberalism depended on the Christian social order, which guaranteed the common consensus of man in order to operate. Today, the liberal, like the Christian, has discovered that nature, which he relied upon as the foundation of his moral and political thought, in fact contradicts those very things which he claims are natural and self-evidently ordained by God. To point out the most obvious one, it is by no means self-evident that all men are created equal. In fact, the opposite is clearly the case. The rule of nature is inequality. All civilizations which we have known eventually collapsed because they, like the walls which defended them, were artificial structures which resisted nature. Civilizations, like walls, eventually crumble and return to the state of nature. But a civilization which is built upon the denial of the fundamental facts of nature and of human nature, which is built upon a falsified view of nature, is especially dangerous. The prosperity of our civilization has allowed us to hold nature at bay for so long that we have become disconnected from the fundamental facts of life, and we are paving the way for nature to return with a vengeance. In America, the left has strayed so far from nature that they routinely deny the existence of basic biological facts, such as the existence of biological genders and gender differences. When they cannot deny the existence of biology and nature, they attack it and seek to eradicate it. They have taken the liberal principle of the freedom and happiness of the individual and the Christian principle of the freedom of the individual from the constraints of biology and nature to an extreme. And to resist the left, liberal conservatives, who make up the majority of the American and European right, can only appeal to a diminishing Christian social consensus, since they cannot appeal to nature. I believe that liberalism will soon be completely destroyed as Western societies become increasingly unstable and the harsh realities of nature set in. Individuals are more committed to their ethnic and religious tribes than to any abstract ideas of government, citizenship, or individual liberty, and human rights are a privilege which are in no way self-evident or guaranteed. Inequality is a fact of life, and moreover, inequality is the precondition of biological life and the mechanism of its most basic functions, the organization of cells into an organism and the generational adaptation of that organism through unequal survival and reproductive outcomes. Most of all, we will come to realize that those who ignore the principles of nature, both individually and on a societal level, are punished harshly. To seek to rebuke nature, to seek to escape biology and negate the laws which govern life and nature is hubris, and those who attempt it are inevitably struck down. Yet the death of liberalism paves the way for the rediscovery of the doctrine of nature. When everyone around you fundamentally misunderstands the very principles of reality, there is no greater tool, no greater weapon that you can have than to study the laws of nature and biology. From diet and the gymnasium to the nature of competition and inequality, having a basic understanding of nature will give you an edge over everyone around you. And perhaps, just as it happened so long ago, while the masses of man have their vision clouded by the doctrines of morality and custom, a new caste of nomadic peoples who see clearly the principles of nature will install themselves as the new ruling caste, the supermen of the new age, just like the heroes of the Bronze Age once did. This, my brothers, is the path forward. Strengthen yourselves, prepare yourselves, for there is still destiny in your eyes. And when you feel that civilization is crumbling all around you, become the barbarians at the gates. In his notebooks, Nietzsche wrote that the Übermensch would be like Caesar with the heart of Christ. This is because Nietzsche's Übermensch is not just a man of worldly power, like Caesar, but also a transvaluer of values, a philosopher king, like Christ. For Nietzsche, the higher man must possess immense physical power and mastery. deadly effectiveness in the world of men and arms, but he must also be a creator and a destroyer of paradigms. At the core of Nietzsche's vision of the Übermensch is the idea of genius. The genius is the man who is the product of many centuries of stored up energies and powers, which all culminate in him, but he is also a stroke of luck, an anomaly of nature. The genius is both a man of necessity and chance. He miraculously appears, or perhaps is manifested, at the perfect time and under the perfect conditions. Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Caesar are all examples of this type of genius. Yet, despite his ardent opposition to Christianity, Nietzsche also recognized Jesus as possessing the qualities of the Übermensch. Jesus was the catalyst for what Nietzsche called the first transvaluation of all values. In Christianity, the aristocratic European value system, which had reigned supreme since distant prehistory, was completely inverted. All that was considered good by the Greeks and the Romans became evil, and all that was considered bad became the virtues of the new age. But Jesus did not bring about this ethos single-handedly. The Christian age could not have come about without Caesar, Jesus' historical counterpart. Julius Caesar was, at the same time, the culmination of Roman society and its values, and their destruction. The Romans, like the Greeks before them, despised monarchy, which they considered barbaric. This seems to have been a common sentiment amongst the Indo-European peoples. Yet Caesar transformed Rome from a republic into an empire, and thus brought about the age of monarchy in Europe. Today we do not know Rome for its republicanism, but for the idea of the Roman emperor, the divinely ordained demigod ruler. Similarly, Christ was a culmination of the visionary project of the Israelites. He positioned himself as the fulfillment of their prophecies and the culmination of their will, as their Messiah. And yet Christ also came as an outsider, like Caesar, and brought about the destruction of the Israelites' religion by universalizing the values of the previously exclusive and tribal religion. Christ positioned himself as the anti-Caesar. In Revelation, the great red dragon who is trying to devour the Messiah is Nero, but more generally, the great red dragon represents the Roman emperor, who in turn represents the power of the Roman Empire and the universalization of aristocratic pagan values. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus famously said, "Render, therefore, unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." This means that the coin, which is stamped with the image of Caesar, should be given to the power of Caesar, who is the master of the earthly realm, but the soul, which is created in the image of God, should be given to the power of God, who rules the spiritual realm of heaven. In Caesar, the dominion of the material world was mastered and universalized with the idea of the divine monarch, and in Christ, the spiritual domain was mastered and universalized with the spread of Christianity's monotheism. Thus, we can see that Christ and Caesar, while being opposites and antitheses, were also inextricably linked and connected, two sides of the same coin, one might say. And the two men shared remarkably similar lives. Both Jesus Christ and Julius Caesar share the same initials. Both men became outcasts in their society, banished to a certain extent for their political actions. Caesar in the wilderness of Gaul, Christ in the desert. Both returned triumphantly from their time in the wilderness to take power and were betrayed by their dear friends. And as a consequence, both suffered gruesome deaths which turned them into martyrs. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, Caesar was stabbed 23 times in the Senate. Christ was publicly executed by the Romans in 33 AD. And if we are to follow the Christian tradition of Christ's resurrection 3 days after his death, then Christ was also likely killed in the spring. Like Christ and Antichrist, Jesus and Caesar could be viewed as spiritual or symbolic brothers, the lamb and the ram, the king of the corporeal and the incorporeal, both killed as springtime sacrifices, which ushered in the new paradigm, and coincidentally came right at the close of the astrological age of Aries, the ram. It is the synthesis of the figures of Caesar and Christ which would define the ethos in the West for the next 500 years. The Romans built the roads by which Christianity spread, and built the institutions and customs by which Christian monarchs would rule. It was this synthesis of Caesar and Christ, the sole divine monarch under the one Christian God, which would define late antiquity and the Middle Ages. And in his Divine Comedy, it is Brutus, Cassius, and Judas who the poet Dante would place in the mouths of Satan to be eternally punished for their betrayal of the highest. In Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche identified the fundamental struggle in the soul of the West as that between the values of Judea and Rome, the Christian and pagan value systems, aristocracy and excellence versus democracy and the rabble. But he was also aware of Rome's crucial role in bringing about the reign of Christianity. In Will to Power, he wrote, "The degeneration of the ruler and of the ruling classes has been the cause of all the great disorders in history. Without the Roman Caesars and Roman society, Christianity would never have prevailed. When it occurs to inferior men to doubt whether higher men exist, then the danger is great. It is then that men finally discover that there are virtues even among inferior, suppressed, and poor-spirited men, and that everybody is equal before God, which is the non plus ultra of all confounded nonsense that has ever appeared on earth. For in the end, higher men begin to measure themselves according to the standard of virtues upheld by these slaves, and discover that they are proud, etc., and that all their higher qualities should be condemned. When Nero and Caracalla stood at the helm, it was then that the paradox arose. The lowest man is of more value than that one on the throne, and thus the path was prepared for the image of God, which was as remote as possible from the image of the mightiest, God on the cross. While Christ is a refutation of Caesar and represents the idea that the lowest is of the highest value, as Nietzsche says, when conjoined, Christ and Caesar would both come to symbolically represent the highest, and moreover, the highest being betrayed and killed by the rabble. It is in the deaths of Caesar and Christ that the end of the monarchic Christian age was foretold. During the Reformation, which began in the 1500s, Christianity was de-Romanized, and Protestantism brought a return to a more sincere interpretation of Christianity's original spirit and scriptures. And during the Enlightenment, which began in the 1600s, monarchy was rejected, for example by the founding fathers of America, in favor of the pre-imperial Roman Republican model. Just as happened with Christianity in Rome, the people, the demos, revolted against monarchic aristocratic power. This movement reached its culmination in the French Revolution, which took place in the 1790s and marked the death of the monarchic age. In the name of democracy, in the name of the people, the rabble, the divine monarchs, the aristocrats, were dragged into the streets, defiled, and executed. Just as Caesar and Christ stood at the genesis of the age which would stretch through late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and into the Renaissance, Napoleon and Goethe stand at the beginning of the liberal democratic age, which is now just coming to a close. Like Caesar and Christ, they transvalued the waning values of their age and gave birth to something new. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche wrote, "Goethe, not a German event, but a European one, a magnificent attempt to overcome the 18th century by a return to nature, by an ascent to the naturalness of the Renaissance, a kind of self-overcoming on the part of that century. He bore its strongest instincts within himself, the sensibility, the idolatry of nature, and the anti-historic, the idealistic, the unreal, and the revolutionary. In the middle of an age with an unreal outlook, Goethe was a convinced realist. He said yes to everything that was related to him in this respect, and he had no greater experience than that ens realissimum, most real being, called Napoleon. Goethe conceived a human being who would be strong, highly educated, skillful in all bodily matters, self-controlled, reverent towards himself, and who might dare to afford the whole range and wealth of being natural, being strong enough for such freedom. The man of tolerance, not from weakness, but from strength, because he knows how to use to his advantage even that from which the average nature would perish. The man for whom there is no longer anything that is forbidden unless it be weakness, whether called vice or virtue." Napoleon and Goethe lived contemporaneously from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, and the two men would meet. After Napoleon's death, Goethe wrote of Napoleon, "Napoleon was the man, always enlightened, always clear and decided, and endowed with sufficient energy to carry into effect whatever he considered advantageous and necessary. His life was the stride of a demigod, from battle to battle and from victory to victory. It might well be said of him that he was found in a state of continual enlightenment. On this account, his destiny was more brilliant than any the world had seen before him, or perhaps will ever see after him." Napoleon rose to power during the French Revolution, and in its aftermath harnessed its energies and sentiments to his advantage. He became the Emperor of France, crowned himself the Holy Roman Emperor, and aspired to a pan-European empire. Just as Nietzsche said of Goethe, Napoleon could be considered a European phenomenon, one of the first truly European men. In Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche called Napoleon a last signpost to the other path, and a synthesis of inhuman and superhuman. Nietzsche saw Napoleon as a last echo of the classical age, the age which aspired to the Superman, to the supreme individual specimen. Like Goethe, Nietzsche admired Napoleon's demigod-like mastery over the world of men and arms, and his tremendous aspirations and will. Yet he saw him as the last of a dying breed. But what if Napoleon was not the last of his kind, but an omen of things to come, just as the end of the Christian monarchic age was foretold in the deaths of Christ and Caesar? The ultimate conclusion of the liberal democratic age is foretold in the figure of Napoleon. When a great leveling takes place, such as the one represented by democracy and liberalism, it provides the perfect conditions for great tyrants to seize power. This was foretold in Nietzsche's prophecy of the Superman. As Europe is democratized, leveled, and homogenized, and the average European is bred and beaten into the type of man who requires a master, who must be commanded because there is no will to command left in him, a new type of man who has the will and vision to aim for hard and lofty goals will rise above the masses and command them towards his ends. And these men, these supermen, will become the masters and aristocrats of the new age, like the heroes of the Bronze Age, the emperors of Rome, and the kings of the Middle Ages. This is what Napoleon as a symbol represents, the birth of the Superman out of a great democratic leveling. In Goethe's Faust, we see the great war and rebellion against nature which would take place during the age of democratic liberalism, and the inevitable fall back to nature which would mark its close. Goethe's play Faust begins with the devil making a wager with God that he can make the faithful scholar, Faust, abandon his faith. Faust is in a state of despair. He has spent his whole life studying the sciences and esoteric knowledge in search of discovering the secrets of nature and the divine, and now, having failed, old and weary, he plans to kill himself. He believes that life has no value. But the devil, Mephistopheles, appears to him and bets that he can show Faust a pleasure which will make him value life. Faust agrees to the deal, thinking that the devil could not possibly succeed, since Faust has become so deeply nihilistic. The devil restores his youth, and Faust enjoys earthly pleasures. Having spent his whole life in search of knowledge and the divine, aspiring to heaven, rejecting earthly life, he now embraces the carnal, the hedonistic, the passionate, and the violent. But in the end of the play, Faust abandons his hedonistic ways and founds a new civilization, becoming a great ruler. It is then that he sees the beauty and value in life, and at that moment, he dies. But since he saw the beauty of life, since he was convinced that life is good, the devil only wins half of his wager. This drama represents the arc of the past 2 ages. Just as Faust's fate was divided between God and the devil, the Christian monarchic age was spent aspiring to the heavens, searching for the philosopher's stone, rejecting the earthly and the carnal, everything deified by the classical age before it. Yet in the liberal age came an abrupt return to nature, to the earthly and the carnal, and a great explosion of violence with the French Revolution and World War II. As Nietzsche wrote, Christianity failed to deliver on its promises, and the result was nihilism, the complete loss of faith in the value of life itself. Whereas Christ and Caesar reached to the heavens, Goethe's Faust foretells an embrace of the earthly, of nature, of the body, of the Antichrist. But it also foretells a time of balance restored, when the great man, the king, the ruler, overcomes his nihilism and again is convinced of the goodness of earthly life. In Napoleon and Goethe, we find everything which was contained within the liberal democratic age, the universalized European, the coming of nihilism to Europe after the failure of Christianity, and the embrace of nature, and the Antichrist which would characterize the 20th century. But like Caesar and Christ in their deaths, Napoleon and Goethe also contain a prophecy of the dawning of the next age, the birth of the great man, the Übermensch, out of the democratic leveling of the masses, and the great man overcoming nihilism and once again believing in the value of life. In Will to Power, Nietzsche wrote, "A certain question constantly recurs to us. It is perhaps a seductive and evil question. May it be whispered into the ears of those who have a right to touch such doubtful problems, those strong souls of today whose dominion over themselves is unswerving. Is it not high time, now that the type gregarious animal is developing ever more and more in Europe, to set about rearing, thoroughly, artificially, and consciously, an opposite type, and to attempt to establish its virtues? And would not the democratic movement itself find, for the first time, a goal, a salvation, and justification, if some one appeared who made use of it, so that at last, besides its new and sublime product, slavery, for this must be the end of European democracy, a higher species of ruling and Caesarian spirits might also be produced, which would stand upon it and would elevate themselves through it. This new species would climb aloft to new and hitherto impossible things, to a broader vision, and to its task on earth." Man, like every animal, has a nature. Birds live naturally in flocks, lions in prides, wolves in packs. Man is no different. The natural division of man is into tribes or clans, extended families. Throughout all of recorded history, from Europe to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, from the Goths, Mongols, and Iroquois, to the medieval houses of Europe and the nation-states of the 19th century, man has always lived in tribes and clans of extended family and kinsmen. And today, in the West, where the tribe has supposedly been overcome and replaced with a civic identity, we continually fall back into tribal identification by race, religion, political ideology, etc., and devote a majority of our attention and time in politics and culture to the various conflicts between these tribal factions. Generally, we in the Western world tend to view tribalism as bad, but is it really tribalism, the mode of living practiced by man for hundreds of thousands of years, which is causing the issue? Or could the supposed problem of tribalism arise from the fact that the very structure of modern society conflicts with the nature of man? Many people in the West feel that modernity is lacking something fundamental. Life feels hollow, empty, without substance. I often had this feeling as a child. As I would lay in bed in the evening, I would slip into fantasies about an ancient world in which I was part of a hunter-gatherer tribe, or a post-apocalyptic world in which nature had reclaimed the cities. I instinctually felt that modern civilization was in some way artificial and temporary, and would one day give way again to the jungle and the tribe. I felt that modernity had separated me from the essence of nature and life, which could only be found in the freedom of the wilderness and the brotherhood of the tribe. In these was something solid and real, something we had lost. In the West, the loss of the tribe has been accompanied by the loss of tradition, religion, and meaning. So is tribalism really at fault, or the lack thereof? In the West, we trace our political heritage back to the Greeks. It was among the Greeks, we say, that complex political theory was born. Among the Athenians, we see the first democracy, our most dear and holy possession, and among the Spartans, we see a predecessor of fascism, the fearful enemy of democracy. But when put into context, the idea that the modern state has any similarity to the early Greek states is somewhat absurd. In Sparta, the individual belonged to and devoted his life to the state. Men were required to devote a majority of their life to military service, women to birthing strong sons. Does this not sound authoritarian, fascistic even? But what do we mean by this word state when we speak about the Spartans? The Spartans are estimated to have been only 10,000 at the height of their population, and as few as 3,000 during their decline. To put that into perspective, Harvard has a student population of 30,000, while the University of Florida has 50,000 students. The Spartans were not a state, they were a tribe. We call them a state because they had laws, customs, kings, and a slave population of as many as 30,000 who they ruled over. But compared to the modern state, the Spartans were nothing more than a small, settled tribe. In ancient Athens, the population may have been 300, even 500,000, including women, foreigners, and slaves, but only the estimated 30,000 native Athenian men had the right to vote in their democracy, far from what we would consider a democratic state. The modern idea of the state, as we trace its origin, was born out of the laws and customs of the various Greek tribes, not out of abstract political ideology or expansive empires. The Romans also began as a tribe, but as they expanded and conquered, bringing in slaves, immigrants, and absorbing entire territories, regions, and peoples, the Romans were no longer a tribe. They became an empire. They became Rome rather than the Romans. And their political structure followed suit. After the death of Caesar, the Roman Republic became an empire, no longer concerned with the will of the Roman people, but rather with the governance and direction of a vast imperium. Naturally, this means that the identity of Rome as a tribe began to break down, and retribalization began to occur within the vast territory which was Rome. This is precisely what is happening in the Western world today. Like Rome, we are almost certainly headed towards a wholesale collapse of the Western Empire, which results in a breakdown into various warring tribal factions. Of course, this is not inevitable, but when compared with the trajectory of the Roman Empire, this seems highly likely. So, what are we to do? There is one people who survived the collapse of Rome, the Jews. By the time that the Romans had conquered them, the Israelites had a settled kingdom and a strong identity. They had made the transition from a nomadic tribe to a settled tribe with laws and customs, just as the Spartans had. But two major obstacles were presented to their success as a people. Firstly, the Romans conquered them and destroyed their temple, which was the center of their cultural and political power. This would be something similar to a foreign nation coming into America, leveling the White House and setting up a temple to their gods in its place. Secondly, Christianity presented a universalized Abrahamic identity for both Jews and other foreigners and immigrants in Rome, an identity which dissolved the idea of the Israelites as a tribe. Just as to be Roman came to mean to be under the rule of the Roman state rather than to be part of the Roman tribe, laws, and customs, with Christianity, to be an Israelite came to mean to be baptized into the Christian religion, not to be part of the tribe which claimed descent from Jacob. Christianity sprung directly out of the religion of the Old Testament and therefore was appealing to many Israelites. But today, those who became Christians are nowhere to be seen, dissolved into the other Middle Eastern populations, their tribal identity lost. Those who remained committed to tribal identity, however, survived and endured to this day. A tribe can survive economic collapse, conquest, slavery. A tribe can move all over the globe, can build civilizations and witness their collapse, and still come out at the other end with their traditions unbroken. All across ancient Europe, from the Vikings and Germanic tribes to the Greeks and Romans, the ancestral traditions and customs which emerged from the synthesis of the Indo-Europeans with the local populations were practiced unbroken for thousands of years. The Germans and the Romans understood themselves as unique and separate peoples, yet they could recognize the traditions and heritage which they shared, even after so many years of separation. But Christianity disrupted this unbroken ancestral tradition. Christianity, a universalized religious identity, combined with the Roman state, a universalized political identity, brought with it a European identity based on ideology, not ancestral custom and tradition. European tribes were forced to give up their customs, their sacred sites were destroyed, the tribes and clans were broken up, and the universal European was created. Of course, since tribal identity cannot be eradicated, the ancient tribal identities of Europe endured to some degree. The Nordic peoples of Europe tend to be Protestant, while the Italo-Celtic peoples tend to be Catholic, the Slavs Orthodox, etc. But the thread which tied all Europeans together, and at the same time gave them their separate and unique identities, was cut. Ancestral customs and traditions, unbroken for thousands of years, were replaced with a universal and non-exclusive identity, the good Christian, and later, the moral Democrat. And in true Roman fashion, we have tried to spread these ideologies across the world. First, in the name of Christianity, we colonized and conquered, and now we do the same in the name of liberal democracy. But inevitably, our vast empire is collapsing, and this is in part because it has no solid foundation. What does the West stand for? Is it democracy, as the liberals say? We have no ownership over this form of government, and our states, vast as they are, no longer function as democracies, but as empires or imperial vassal states, which seldom represent or enact the will of the people. Do we then stand for Christianity, as the conservatives say? The West has just as little claim to Christianity as it does to democracy. Christianity began in the Levant, and it is fastest growing in South America and Africa, fastest declining in Europe. Anyone, anywhere, can be a Christian. Anyone, anywhere, can be a Democrat. When a state grows to a certain size, it ceases to be a state and becomes an empire. The type of governance, whether democratic, republican, monarchic, communist, or fascist, matters little. And the same is true for a religion, because both the basis of religion and the state is the tribe. When a state becomes too vast, the populace inevitably breaks down into smaller tribal factions, as is currently happening in America. And when a religion becomes too abstract and inclusive, it breaks down into smaller factions, as happened with Christianity and its multitude of denominations. The great challenge of modernity is that we find ourselves in an ever-changing landscape, which is compounded in the West by the fact that we are in a crumbling, or at least highly unstable, empire. Between rapid technological advancements and the resultant social changes, the assortment of ever-changing political and social ideologies, mass migration, and perhaps soon even space exploration, it is easier than ever for the individual to be lost in the tides of space and time, without direction and purpose, without home or brotherhood. This is why forming new tribal identities is essential in modernity. They are rafts which can easily weather stormy waters, even if our ships are destroyed. Retribalization presents the opportunity for the atomized individual to return to a more natural and fulfilling way of life as part of a clan or tribe, and in the West, it presents us with the opportunity to revive our ancient tribal traditions, which were practiced unbroken for thousands of years and continued unbroken well into the Christianization of Europe and even into modernity. In these traditions, we find the true source of who we are, and from them we can draw the vitality and wisdom which we need to bring about a renaissance of the Western spirit in the coming years. In the West, complex civilization has always brought with it an amnesia and a loss of our traditions and customs, a turn to superstitions and political ideologies, as happened in Greece and Rome. But the barbarian, in all his splendor and ferocity, has always brought with him a rekindling of the flame of tradition. At the edge of the village, in the shadows of the jungle, there crouches a tiger, and in his eyes there is lightning. Why do empires rise and fall? This question has occupied emperors, historians, and philosophers alike since the writings of the Greeks, and probably long before. Yet the cause of the rise and the fall of empires can be found in a simple biological principle, which Nietzsche laid out in his writings. When weak, life seeks out power. When strong, it seeks to discharge its power. Nietzsche called this principle der Wille zur Macht, the will to power. And further, when exhausted, life seeks first pleasure and extreme stimulus, then finally nothingness and annihilation. Nietzsche called this decadence and nihilism, the final stages of an organic being's life cycle. Nietzsche's principle of the will to power explains why all great civilizations begin with the barbarian, filled with vitality and energy, strengthened by the harsh conditions of his lifestyle in nature, eager for conquest and glory. And why, once these barbarians have discharged their energy in the creation of empire, decadence and nihilism inevitably set in. You can view this cycle on an individual level in fighters, who become softened by luxury once they achieve success, and in celebrities who turn to drugs and become suicidal and depressed once they have achieved the heights of fame. The laws of the will to power can be observed both on an individual and collective level, because they describe the very nature of power and energy. When one lacks it, they seek to acquire it, and when they have it, they seek to discharge it. Our conception of the barbarian is a man who is cruel, savage, rugged, uncivilized, but this is only because we live in a decadent age. To those peoples who we retrospectively consider to be barbarians, it is the civilized man who is barbaric, decadent, and immoral. To the Persians invading Greece, the Spartans were a rustic bunch of nobodies who could not possibly think that they could stand up to the might and sophistication of the Persian Empire. But to the Spartans, it was the Persians who were uncivilized barbarians. And perhaps the victors of that conflict stand as a testament to whose perspective is correct. The word barbarian comes from the Greeks, and it was meant to mimic Persian speech. Bar, bar, bar. This means that our idea of the barbarian in modernity is actually an inversion of its original meaning. We view ourselves as more moral and civilized than the barbarian. But could the opposite actually be the case? When we look at those historical peoples who we consider to be more barbaric than us, we find that they were also more moral than we are. The Spartans, who we view as barbaric and in a certain sense primitive, are a great example of this. In Plutarch's saying of the Spartans, he encapsulates the simple and uncompromising virtue of King Leonidas when faced with certain death at Thermopylae. Knowing that the Greek forces were about to be outflanked by the Persians, Leonidas stayed behind with his 300 Spartans to hold the pass long enough for the rest of the Greek forces to retreat and regroup. Plutarch writes, quote, Xerxes wrote to him, "It is possible for you, by not fighting against God, but by arranging yourself on my side, to be the sole ruler of Greece." But Leonidas wrote in reply, "If you had any knowledge of the noble things in life, you would refrain from coveting others' possessions. But for me, to die for Greece is better than to be the sole ruler over the people of my race." When Xerxes wrote again, "Hand over your arms," Leonidas wrote in reply, "Come and take them." Being asked why the best of men prefer a glorious death to an inglorious life, he said, "Because they believe the one to be nature's gift, but the other to be within their own control." End quote. We can see that the Spartans were far more moral and noble in their actions than we are. They valued freedom and honor over their own lives. They would rather die a noble death than be seen as cowards, and even desired such a death and considered it to be the highest of all honors. This attitude is characteristic of the barbarian. The Greeks, the Vikings, the Germanic warriors, the Spartans, even the samurai, all thought it to be a blessing to die at the height of one's power, when discharging one's energy in a glorious deed. In other words, to never reach the stage of life when one's will is exhausted. One might conceptualize the barbarian as a people in its youth, in the first stage of the cycle of the will to power. Tacitus, in his Germania, noted how the Germanic tribes were much stricter in their virtue and morality than the Romans. He depicts the German tribes as having a more decentralized form of governance, with leadership based on merit and leaders chosen for their wisdom and military prowess. He highlights the martial nature of the Germanic tribes, where men are judged by their valor in battle, and warfare is considered to be the most noble pursuit. He emphasizes the value placed on personal freedom by the Germanic tribes. Just like the Spartans, individuals are free to choose their leaders, and there is a strong aversion to any form of despotism. This was also the case for the Romans before they became an empire. Tacitus writes that personal honor is of great importance to the Germanic tribes, and that a stain on one's reputation can have severe consequences. He writes that the Germanic tribes generally practice monogamy, and that men are content with a single wife, and marital fidelity is valued. Tacitus contrasts this with the laxity of Roman marital customs, and he also notes that in the Germanic tribes, women are consulted on important matters and seen as having a significant influence within the family. Contrary to the belief of most in the modern world, whether liberals or conservative Christians, we do not become more moral as civilization grows more complex. In our case, we are less virtuous than most of our ancestors. The barbarian is more harsh and violent than the civilized man, since he lives a rugged life close to the wildness and savagery of nature. But it is for this exact reason that he is also more virtuous. The virtue of the barbarian is fully embodied and beautiful in its clarity and simplicity. When forced to choose between dishonor or death, he chooses death without hesitation. When the honor of his kinsman is slighted, he readily dies in the pursuit of vengeance. His will is strong and unyielding. He is eager for struggle and challenge and does not shrink from either life or death. It is this spirit which allowed the Spartans to dominate the Peloponnese, the Macedonians under Alexander to conquer all of Greece and Asia, the Romans to build their sprawling empire, and after them, the Germanic peoples to establish the royal houses of the Middle Ages. But the luxury and comfort of civilization brings with it a loosening of morality and a weakening of will. In civilization, even the most barbaric people will begin to become soft and fat off of the spoils of victory. In his manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, Ted Kaczynski discusses this phenomena, which Nietzsche called decadence. He writes, quote, "Human beings have a need, probably based in biology, for something that we will call the power process. This is closely related for the need for power, which is widely recognized, but is not quite the same thing. The power process has 4 elements. The 3 most clear-cut of these we call goal, effort, and attainment of goal. Everyone needs to have goals whose attainment requires effort, and needs to succeed in attaining at least some of his goals." End quote. Nietzsche described this as the drive for self-overcoming, which he closely associated with the will to power. Ted Kaczynski continues, quote, "Consider the hypothetical case of a man who can have anything he wants just by wishing for it. Such a man has power, but he will develop serious psychological problems. At first he will have a lot of fun, but by and by he will become acutely bored and demoralized. Eventually he may even become clinically depressed. History shows that leisure aristocracies tend to become decadent. This is not true of fighting aristocracies that have to struggle to maintain their power. But leisured, secure aristocracies that have no need to exert themselves usually become bored, hedonistic, and demoralized, even though they have power. This shows that power is not enough. One must have goals towards which to exercise one's power. Everyone has goals. if nothing else, to obtain the physical necessities of life. Food, water, and whatever clothing and shelter are made necessary by the climate. But the leisured aristocrat obtains these things without effort, hence his boredom and demoralization. Non-attainment of important goals results in death if the goals are physical necessities, and in frustration if non-attainment of the goals is compatible with survival. Consistent failure to attain goals throughout life results in defeatism, low self-esteem, or depression. Thus, in order to avoid serious psychological problems, a human being needs goals whose attainment requires effort, and he must have a reasonable rate of success in attaining his goals." End quote. Here, Ted Kaczynski essentially lays out two Nietzschean principles: the will to power, the essential drive within life which seeks overcoming, growth, and power, and the domestication of man within civilization, the exhaustion of his will to power, which results in first decadence and then nihilism. The decadent stage of civilization, or of an individual organism, comes when they have acquired great power and mastery over the world, and their primary drive shifts from the acquisition of power to the discharge of power. The beginning of a civilization's decadent stage is actually usually its golden age. However, from this great success, three issues inevitably arise. Firstly, exhaustion of the will, which has discharged its energy in every way possible and turns to the pursuit of pleasure and comfort. Secondly, a weakening of the will and loosening of discipline and virtue caused by the comforts and pleasures of success. And finally, the issues which Ted Kaczynski described, which are caused by the simulated environment of a wealthy civilization. Today, in the West, we are in the final stage of decadence, which is nihilism. We could be building the most advanced and beautiful civilization ever seen on Earth, or colonizing our solar system, but we lack the will to embark on such projects, and even the discipline to organize them. A young man born into the West today is the victim of a soft upbringing which at no point ever comes into contact with nature, and does not instill in him virtue, discipline, or even an understanding of the basic realities of life. And if this does not make him a weak and soft creature whose only pursuit is pleasure, he will turn into a creature resembling a lion in a zoo, because he is unable to fulfill his biological imperative, the will to power. There are no outlets for his instincts, which allow self-overcoming, the accumulation of power, and the mastery of the material world. Since there are no outlets for his instincts, which could allow self-overcoming, the accumulation of power, and mastery over the material world, he will quickly discover that he can only discharge his energies through the pursuit of pleasure, which inevitably leads to indifference and nihilism. But there is a way out for the individual. The imposition of artificial pressures upon yourself. Taking up jiu-jitsu, boxing, or some other fighting sport is the first step. This will give you a healthy outlet to expend your energies and to exert your will. You will become reacquainted with your instincts and your embodied physicality, and therefore with nature. And further, lifting and fighting will teach you discipline and embodied virtue. But this alone is not enough. You must rekindle the wildness of the barbarian in your heart. And it is here that I have no concrete path forward as of yet. Individually, this can be achieved any number of ways, but how can it be achieved in a way which is replicable? How can it be achieved collectively? Today, in the West, we shrink away from the sight of the barbarian, who is the embodiment of nature and reminds us of the cruel and unforgiving reality of life. We view the ancients as unsophisticated, bloodthirsty beasts and accuse them of pagan immorality. Yet, as we discussed earlier, these beasts, though more fearsome and terrible, were also far more virtuous than we are. The barbarian says yes to life and death. He says yes to nature and all its beauty and cruelty, and nature in turn makes him both beautiful and terrible. The civilized man shrinks from both life and death, instead seeking pleasure and comfort, and for this, nature punishes him. We must recognize the fact that we are civilized men, that we are the product of the most domesticated civilization to hitherto exist. But we should not despair, for if we can recognize this, embrace it even, say yes to it, and go beyond it, perhaps we may create something beyond civilization and the barbarian, something never before seen on Earth, and thus far imagined only by Nietzsche, something both beautiful and terrible, a product both of nature and of civilization, something both beast and god, human and inhuman, something beyond. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, "Could you create a god? Then I bid you, be silent about all gods. But you could well create the Superman. Perhaps not you yourselves, my brothers, but into fathers and forefathers of the Superman, you could transform yourselves. And let that be your best creating."